Hey everyone, welcome to PunkCast. My name is William Maxwell. I'm a student of Web3 and the owner of Punk4736. Cryptopunks are 10,000 uniquely generated characters stored permanently on the Ethereum blockchain. No punk is the same. This is a show dedicated to celebrating the punks behind the punk. My hope for this podcast is that we capture the essence of the punk culture, elevate the brand and the individual behind the punk. One last thing. Projects discussed on the show is not financial advice. Crypto and NFTs are a volatile and risky asset class. Please always do your own research. Other than that, let's go. Hi everyone, and welcome back to PunkCast. Today we've got Punk4736. He's a Atty, hosting a Frown and eye patch. He's a street photographer, artist, author, and activist, but often refers to himself as a Misanthorologist. He currently heads up Web3 exploration at Obey Giant, an advisor for GMJP, an associate professor at Japan's Keio University, and co-founder of Safecast, an environmental open data nonprofit. Please welcome Mr. Sean Bonner to the show. Sean, how are you?
I'm doing fantastic. Thanks so much for having me.
No, awesome. Delighted to and excited to have you here on the show. I was just reading through, I guess, your blogs and your bio. You've done so much in such a, I guess, a limited amount of time. I'd love to sort of dig into.
It feels like it's been forever. So I don't know that there's a limited time.
Yeah. Well, where do we start? I mean,
let's jump in.
So maybe you can just give us a bit of intro, I guess, to yourself and the background, and we can sort of start unpicking elements of that, right? Because I'd love to sort of get into some of that with you.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I guess I'll give a quick background that kind of led up to NFTs at least, and then we can kind of talk a little bit about that before we jump into any of that stuff. Maybe that's a good way to do it. So, I started a record label when I was in high school. That's like the beginning of all this stuff. So I started a punk rock label because I wanted to put out my friends' bands, and back in the late 80s, early 90s, if you wanted to, be involved with punk, you had to do something, and I wasn't really good at playing instruments, so I decided to put out my friends' records. So that was good and bad, because basically it made me unemployable for the rest of my life, because once you learn how to that you can like just go do something if you want to, then it's very hard to get a real job after that. So I put out records for a while and got really excited about the internet at the same time, because that was all kind of just happening at the same time. So I was like trying to sell records on IRC and like making a web page with like hand coding HTML to like try to like get band stuff out there. So music was like a huge piece of my world, and I started designing records for other record labels, and just trying to be a part of that world as much as possible. And so I designed a whole bunch of records, created a whole bunch of logos, and then started really like connecting more with the artists than sort of the business aspect of it. And because I have a habit of like making a business out of things that I love and then ruining them for myself. I started an art gallery, I started doing things with art galleries, and like, helping book artists in galleries and representing artists, and ended up having an art gallery in Chicago for a while, and then moved to Los Angeles with that. And this was all when, by this point, was sort of, early .com. I was doing some web stuff with Playboy, and then started, just kind of doing my own web things, and then started doing like more community stuff online, and trying to find, like small networks of communities that were doing cool shit on the internet. So then I just sort of shifted focus from the art world into that world for a bit, and then did that for quite a while. And then once this earthquake happened in Japan in 2011, I realized that a bunch of my network, a bunch of people that I knew could probably help out somehow. And so that was when we ended up starting this nonprofit called Safecast, and it was to focus on environmental monitoring, primarily radiation at first, and then we started doing air quality as well. And this was 12 years ago now. So we were putting data into public domain. We were, some of the first projects to start publishing environmental data that way, and created this huge data set of open data, open environmental data that governments and anybody could use, and did that for, most of a decade. Moved to Japan to focus on that. And so then when the NFT kind of things started happening, and one thing I should say is that with the nonprofit, we did the open data, but we also were looking at a lot of how to use blockchain to sort of independently verify environmental data, so that you could ensure that data that was being published out in the world wasn't being manipulated by a government or some company or something. So I had these like two different worlds in my life, blockchain and tech stuff and art stuff. So you can see where, once the NFT thing started happening, that was like, oh, these are my universes coming slamming together. And I figured that my artist friends would probably need to learn about blockchain, and my blockchain friends would need to learn about artists. And so I just jumped in, and I kind of learned things by doing them myself. So I started minting my photos right away and trying to make NFTs of my own stuff, so that I could tell people how they could do it with their stuff. And that just has, kind of spiraled into this huge love of this new stuff, that so much of what's going on feels like the early internet in the 90s to me, of like anything's possible and there's not companies standing in your way. And it just all feels very, very exciting and delightful. So that's kind of what led up to, 2 years ago.
Man, so there's a lot of things that you sort of unpack there. Well, first off, I think just the start of your career trying to sell punk sort of records and rock bands is definitely signals punk vibes already, right? So,
yeah.
Indie sort of counterculture type thing, and I think that sort of also led you to the technology sort of element to really try and help market a lot of that stuff and explore communities as well. Which seems like a natural fit for where we are today, right?
Yeah, I feel like those roots have kind of played into everything I've touched in one way or another. But it's that strong sort of DIY aspect of like, we can figure out a way to just make this happen. We don't necessarily have to go ask somebody if we're allowed to do it. We can go do it and then figure out whether we were allowed to do it later on. We could build stuff. There's always a solution. It might not exist yet. We can come up with it. And then also that very strong community aspect of, me and my small community are going to do this thing, and whether the rest of the world pays any attention to it or not doesn't really matter, because we're not doing it for them. We're doing it for us. And, that's just, sort of an ethos that I've tried to attach in everything I've ever done. And so I'm very excited that, a lot of those things are resonating with, sort of Web3 communities in different ways right now as well. It feels good. It feels like where things should have gone 20 years ago, in many
Absolutely.
ways. Yeah.
Amazing. I think when you're sort of saying that as well, I sort of feel the same way about PunkCast in some ways, right? Sort of doing it just for punks, right? And just us. And then just having a look through your website and your bio as well, I think you use the word misanthropologist. Can you just help explain what that is and what that sort of means to you?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's a made up word, of course. It doesn't actually exist. If you Google it, you're only going to find me.
I did Google it actually, but
yeah. It was kind of a play on words, because sort of like misanthropologist, but also misanthropo, and then also, anthropologist kind of jammed together. I think it plays into sort of that subcultures and small communities aspect, right? Something that I find very interesting, of course, is small communities are often very kind of skeptical of outsiders in lots of ways, so they're very positive on their community, but also very skeptical of, outsiders coming into it, and so I found that as a common theme throughout, all of these sort of little circles and communities online and off that I've, sort of lived among and between throughout everything, whether that's, punk rock stuff or internet stuff or whatever it is, right? It's like small groups of people who deeply trust each other, and also, know that it's sort of dangerous outside of that circle in different ways. And then seeing those kind of things, the same sort of themes and problems come up in those communities again and again and again, I think is something that I find super fascinating. So that's sort of why I made it up. And it's also hard to explain what I do. Like, I mean, how do I explain that background that I just told you in like one word? So I figured I'd just make a word that nobody would know what it meant.
Well, it worked.
Yeah.
That's super interesting. I guess, for Web3 and the communities that I've been in, I think being involved in communities, I probably didn't appreciate it until sort of Web3, but it sounds like you've been in it for quite some time and you're starting to pick up, various similarities. And I think when you said, we're a little bit cautious of outsiders coming in, I sort of feel like that is very true. Mm-hmm. And you can sort of hear that narrative being sung now, even just with the NFT Web3 community, this concept of VCs are bad. They're going to come in, they're going to take all the profits. We're very protective of our community. We're very critical of brands coming into the space because we sort of feel like they're coming in to be value extractive as opposed to really trying to add and contribute to the community in some ways.
Exactly. Yeah.
But yeah, so I think, it's interesting that you've sort of picked that out. I mean, just maybe if you can share, I guess, some of your insights from like, I guess, punk culture, some of the other communities that you sort of seen some of those things play out.
Well, I mean, I think that you're identifying the right trend there. I mean, to tie it back to punk rock, I mean that, it goes to, independent bands signing with major labels, right? And they're selling out, right? And then that whole, like, what happens with that when, the band that you and your 20 friends deeply loved, all of a sudden there's thousands of people that love them, right? Is your appreciation for that band somehow less important now? Less important to you, maybe less important to them? Like, how does that change that dynamic, right? You can't just go down the street and see them play in a small club, with your 20 friends anymore, because now anytime they play, they sell out 1,000-person venue or something, right? So like how those influxes of money, but also popularity, how that kind of changes things. And I think that, you could see that, through the kind of Web 2.0 world of like, people jumping online and starting to build stuff. And then, these kind of giant monolithic companies coming in and sort of bulldozing over and taking control of all of it. And I feel like in a lot of ways, Web3 is a little bit of a rebellion from that, kind of going back to the initial ideas like, hey, this is our world. We don't need, sort of a corporate overlord on it in a lot of ways. But even with CryptoPunks, right, you can see, many years of nobody caring about them except for a small group of people. And then it hits this point where, more people find out about it. Right. And so, that's not necessarily a good or a bad thing. It's just a thing. Right. And it changes something. Right. And so when you have, the group that cares about something quadruple in size or 10x in size or something, the dynamic is going to change. And, if you look at it one way, that's good. If you look at it another way, it's different. Another way, it's bad, right? I mean, there's all kinds of different angles for that, but that's where I think some of that caution comes from. And that's where, community management, to use sort of a more current term, but it wasn't always called community management, but, just sort of how do you handle the way things are growing and changing? Because something growing to the point where more people can enjoy it is not necessarily a bad thing, right? But if it loses the thing that made it special in that process, then maybe it is a bad thing, right? And so it's kind of like, how do you keep that, that specialness and that thing that made you fall in love with it? How do you let that grow so that more people can enjoy it in that same way, but still keep that piece for you? So I think that those are, kind of interesting things that all communities kind of wrestle with, as their thing grows, because nothing ever stays stagnant, right? So it's either going to get smaller and die or get bigger, right? It's never going to just stay exactly the same forever. So you kind of have to try to find a way to balance that and find the things that work for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as you're sort of speaking, I can sort of see a lot of similarities with CryptoPunks, right? And the journey that
Sure.
the CryptoPunks have sort of been on. Really indie counterculture, vibing ourselves for a while, and then obviously, money in some ways complicates things, right?
Yeah.
Matt and John deciding to exit Yuga, taking the helm, definitely sort of saw or felt some ramifications of that.
And I think it also speaks a little bit to the kind of confusing situation that it was in before the sale, right? Because technically they were owned by this company, but they were also kind of like absentee parents because they weren't around paying attention to anything, right? So the community was always sort of on its own, but also kind of attached, right? Like Matt and John could just go do something with the brand, and the community couldn't do anything about it or had no say in it. But it also felt like they weren't doing anything. It was just a very awkward thing. So the sale, in some ways, at least gives like clear answers, right? Right. It sort of removes some of those open questions, even if those answers weren't necessarily things that everybody was excited about. It was at least an answer, right? And so it's sort of interesting to see how that plays out in the community again, right? Some people love it, some people are skeptical of it, some people hate it.
Absolutely. Right. So tell me a little bit more about your transition into NFT. So you were in Japan, working with Safecast. What was that sort of first point in time when you came across NFTs, and how did you sort of drift into buying your first one?
So, having been on, online for all of this time, right? I mean, I got into crypto in, 2010 or 2011 or something, right? So, I was aware of that. I used to run a hackerspace in Los Angeles, and we had Bitcoin user group meetups and stuff, right, in the sort of early years of it. So blockchain stuff was kind of always in my peripheral, and then with Keio University in Japan, we started the blockchain research lab in conjunction with Safecast to sort of do some of that research of like what are some other things that we can do with blockchains. As a technology, what can we build on them in different ways? And we worked a bit with MIT's digital currency initiative in the same kind of way, although that was more focused on money. But the idea with that being money is very hard, and so if you can solve it for money, then you can also solve it for other things. Whereas if you try to solve it for something easy, you're going to run into a problem later when money comes up with it. So again, being interested in art and all of these things, I think I came across NFTs many different times over the years. I had a friend that worked on CryptoKitties. I was sent the page to claim Cryptopunks by a friend and couldn't figure out how to change my Bitcoin to Ethereum. Couldn't figure out how to set up a wallet, so I gave up. So that's a fantastic win story right there. I didn't claim CryptoPunks when I had the chance to, just because I couldn't figure it out, and I wasn't quite sold on that idea yet, because as a designer and as an artist and as an everything, the idea of like, why would I want somebody else to make my avatar? Like, I'd make my own avatar, like that was that was sort of in my mind. So I was like, well, I'm not going to spend too much money on this. But or too much time or anything, right? But over the years, kind of following that, when I made that connection of, oh, this is a collectible thing in the same way that these other things are collectible, right? Even in punk rock, right, we have like colored vinyl or limited releases or things that people are excited about, and like some of the earliest stuff I did online was like building websites for these like Japanese toy collector communities and stuff, right? So like that world of like, here's collectible things and rarity, and like all of that makes a lot of sense to me. And it's kind of the worlds I grew up in. So once I connected like this new thing of like digital objects to that, I was like, oh, okay, that makes that makes way more sense. But it was sort of just happening over there, so I wasn't paying a ton of attention to it. And so it was kind of at the start of the pandemic, stopped going into the office so much and was just sort of messing around online. And I knew we were getting ready to move from Tokyo to Vancouver. And so I don't know, random web search of the moment, or maybe somebody mentioned something on Twitter. I don't know. I fell down, a couple different research things and ended up bouncing around on OpenSea, looking on Nifty Gateway, just sort of looking at all of this stuff. And there was kind of this moment where I had this realization, like, oh, there's been a lot more happening here than the last time I looked. Like this is suddenly really, really kind of interesting. And I think that was sort of 2020-ish, maybe end of 2019, early 2020. I don't really know the exact.
Do you remember your first NFT that you bought?
I don't. It was probably some random OpenSea shared storefront something. I think I got a couple of my friends to do stuff. So I think my friend Mark Frown made an NFT and I bought one of his, and my friend Jory, made one and I bought one of his, and I made some and I sent them to them. So I think that the first few that I got were probably either just some random thing that was cheap, just so that I could be like, look, I bought something. Or my friends, my friend Harper also, I think, was the first person I knew that made something where you could mint it. Whereas the other ones, those guys were just doing stuff on OpenSea's shared storefront. But Harper made this fun thing that was called fake.sale, I think. And it was like bootleg NFTs. So it was like, you didn't know what you were going to get. You're just like, give me a fake NFT. And then it would like randomly look on OpenSea and like grab the image from something and like give you a fake thing. And then they deleted it, like OpenSea pulled it down or whatever before too long. But it was just kind of like this fun, like goofy, I'm going to mint a new thing, but it's just like, and it was called fake. Like, this is a fake thing, but like they took it down. So that might've been the first thing I ever minted in that way. But there was like, it kind of was like gradually, then suddenly, it was like a week or two, and then I was suddenly grabbing tons of stuff from having like, look, I have 2 NFTs to like, I've got 30, now I've got 50, it's just like way too many to keep track of really fast.
And so you're an artist and street photographer, and I've seen some of your stuff on I think it was on it wasn't Foundation, or was it Foundation? It was Foundation.
Yeah. Most of my stuff's on Foundation.
Yeah, some really cool stuff that you've got in there too. So like, when you were looking at NFTs, were you looking at it from the creator perspective, or were you looking at more from the collector perspective initially?
I mean, those things are very jammed together in my mind, I mean, I ran an art gallery, and so I have a huge like physical art collection. But as an artist, I make stuff as well. So like, artists are trading work all the time, in my mind. So if you're making art, you're trading with other artists and you're having things. So collecting and making are kind of one and the same, from that place. And so I think when I got really interested in it, my first, I would say probably still to this day, I'm more interested in it from an artist perspective, and why is this good for artists, and what does this change, and what problems does this fix? What problems does Web3 sort of fix that exist in the traditional art world in a lot of ways? But then I also appreciate it, because as a collector, right? I like being able to like have a collection that doesn't take up tons of physical space, that I'm not worried about if the temperature is bad in a room, is that going to affect something? I had a large painting one time that the way that the artist sealed it, like it got moldy from the inside out and was destroyed, so it's like those sort of physical problems don't exist, which is really exciting as a collector. But also, the provenance, or all of those things. So I think there's like, I can kind of argue for, many different angles of why I think it's all exciting. Yeah.
That's interesting. So your time as a gallerist, you obviously must have an eye for art and appreciation for narratives and stories around it. Talk to us about, I guess, applying that to the CryptoPunks collection itself and your journey into CryptoPunks. What did you sort of see at that point in time?
Yeah. So, once I kind of came back around, again, kind of 2020 ish, into NFTs and started seeing, the CryptoPunks all around. The thing that I got most interested in right away, excuse me, was starting to see all the derivatives. Once I started seeing derivatives everywhere, that's what really made me recognize the sort of cultural impact that CryptoPunks were having. And that's what sort of made me go back to them as an art object and kind of really dive into it. Because, growing up on the internet, pixel art was a thing I was used to, right? Pixel people, all of that stuff that wasn't necessarily new or exciting on its own for me, right? But then seeing this and sort of then revisiting the palette and looking at the size and the colors and seeing like, oh, okay, here's these kind of forced limitations, and how many very, very sort of drastic personality differences you can kind of see in just these small number of pixels. Like, so once I kind of went back and spent time with the collection, it resonated with me in a different way. It's sort of like if you go to a museum or something and you kind of just walk past something and you kind of recognize it, it's very different than if you go spend time like staring at it for a while. You start noticing the kind of little details in it and all of that. So I think that I had that little bit of a moment, but it was really the fact that I started to see all of these other people being inspired to create their own work from, using this as kind of the motivation. And then again, applying that to, the rest of my life, right? Seeing something that kind of inspires a culture to grow and run, whether intentionally or unintentionally. Maybe even unintentionally is better, right? Because if Larva Labs was like, hey, everybody copy our stuff, then it wouldn't have seemed, as organic or as natural, right? It was people just deciding to rip it off, right? Or people just deciding to do that sort of stuff that's actually a really good sign culturally of like, wow, this is having an impact, like people are resonating with this in more ways. And so I think that that's really what got me, to sort of start spending much more time with it and looking around for it consciously.
Awesome. And then when you, there's a few things I probably want to ask you about that. One is how do you feel about derivative punk projects? Because I think there's a whole narrative around licensing and CCO and all those other elements. How do you sort of see that positive, negative?
We can unpack that in many different directions. I think that so let's split it from cultural and legal, because they're two different things. So I think that from a cultural standpoint and just like kind of a personal interest standpoint, I love the kind of rich ecosystem that has grown around CryptoPunks. So I love derivatives. I love, I mentioned to somebody else this afternoon, I was to Moxley, I think. And I was talking about how like I like going into like old junk shops or whatever and finding like bootleg toys of like toy lines that I know, right? Because you're like, oh wow, like somebody was so inspired by this thing that they went and spent money to try to produce this thing that's like kind of like it, and so I think that's a really exciting thing. That said, not all derivatives are created equal, right? I really like things that kind of add to the narrative and sort of create more lore around it and sort of, make the story bigger and larger. Things that are sort of, arguably cheap copies or knockoff, like that kind of stuff is less interesting to me. Again, I see the value of it. I understand the importance on it, but for, sort of my personal kind of collecting or interest, I like things that are building stuff. And even if you're kind of reusing elements from other projects, but trying to build something new with it, I think is kind of very cool and interesting. On the sort of legal aspect of, licensing and copyright and all of those things. I mean, I come from, the sharing economy world of the internet, right? I come from Creative Commons. I come from, all of that stuff. So I think that it's better for culture when things are open. I think that trying to lock down things doesn't work out the way people expect it to. I also understand from an artist's perspective being, needing to be able to protect their own work, right? And go after somebody if their stuff's being stolen. How that applies to CryptoPunks is a very, very, very different question, because it's not like I drew something and then somebody copied my drawing. Once you get into a generative work, once you get into, sort of computer created, like there's a lot of different things that change with that. And some of it, I feel like, if the enforcement gets too heavy handed, it can actually be negative. So I think there's lots of different pieces that are both good and bad about it. It's not an easy answer.
Yeah, it's a tough one, especially in Web3, and where the thing about licensing and rights is that we're assuming that local rules and regulations and jurisdictions will honor them. And I think in the world that we live in, it's basically borderless, right? And so,
I mean, even in the United States, though, or in North America, right? I mean, the laws are different between Canada and the U.S. The laws are different from state to state. I mean, it's like, having my own art and knowing what I deal with to try to protect it globally, having brands that I've worked with that, it's a huge mess to try to say, oh, here's the policy for the entire world. Like that's just, it doesn't really work that way. So, it's better to sort of try to figure out how to work with your fans. Right. I mean, I think some of this in a way kind of goes back to, kind of Napster, in Napster days of like, bands suing their fans doesn't ever work out good for either of them. Right. So it's like, how do you create a situation where an artist, is able to share things, but also still benefit? And I think actually that's something that Web3 does very well by making the consumption ubiquitous, but the ownership rare, right? Mm-hmm. So it's not that I don't want anybody to listen to my music or, share my stuff around. Like, please, like, share it as much as possible. Like the fact that you're sharing it means you actually like it, right? But also lock in this piece of, the ownership so that the artist can still benefit from that in a way, right? And that's where royalties even get, really, really powerful for artists. And I mean, again, there's 100 threads this can go when you're talking about Web3 at this point.
Absolutely. Well, let's not open up that can of beans. But no, I appreciate your comments there. Really insightful. And just getting back onto your CryptoPunk 4736 in particular. Talk to us a little bit about the purchasing process there. Like, how did you think about traits? Was this specific one that you sort of hone in on? Frown and eye patch is pretty cool.
Yeah. So, once I started getting back in, getting into the NFTs and getting into this stuff, I mean, I always kind of had it in my head, like, I have to get one of these CryptoPunks. This is an important cultural artifact of this time. But I also, like, the prices were always just kind of like a little out of my reach. I I could have pulled something off, but it was always like I didn't want to just buy something to have it, like that was sort of the thing. So I think like, when I first remember saying, okay, I want to go get one of these things, they were like 10 ETH, and I was like, well, I've got like 6 ETH to spend, so it's a little out of my range, right? But then, I sold some stuff and, traded some other stuff around, and, maybe I had 11 ETH and they were 10 ETH, but I was like, well, I don't really like any of the 10 ETH ones that much, and I don't want to spend everything I have to get something that I don't really like. And again, I, coming from that like gallery world and art collector world, like, you don't buy art unless you're happy with it stuck on your wall forever, So, I wasn't thinking at that point really of like this being the gateway to a community, right? Because I think that's something that's developed significantly over the past 2 years across Web3, in ways that was not immediately apparent and might not still be immediately apparent to people coming into Web3, right? So I kind of had this little bit of cat and mouse thing for quite a while, where the prices would go up and then it would be like way out of my reach, and then I would sort of stack ETH and okay, now it's back in reach, but I don't really want to get anything that was right there. And all the while I was helping other people. So I have a whole lot of friends that wanted to get Cryptopunks. So I was helping them find stuff. And so I was spending a lot of time digging through the collection, digging through deals, and sort of finding and starting to familiarize myself with like, okay, here's the traits that kind of jump out at me. Here's the stuff that I find interesting. But, again, anytime that I was like, okay, I could go buy one of these things, it just wasn't really working for me. And then I found out about the V1s actually first, and not first, but the first Cryptopunks I was able to actually like go buy were V1s. And it was because I had known about them for a while and the sort of story on it, because again, sort of researching this thing, but I didn't know how to get them. And I didn't know where that was. And so it was like shortly after Frank's Rapper was released, that I was like, okay, this is, I'm going to get one of these things. And I traded a mutant ape that, was like an airdrop, right, that I had gotten. So basically free. So the first sort of real CryptoPunk thing that I got, I traded for it. So I thought that was like a cool piece of it. And again, I'm still helping people buy CryptoPunks and do this sort of stuff, but I was kind of hesitant. I didn't want to just like rush in and get something. And then I started talking to Tony Herrera, and he kind of, alluded to that he had, some that he had claimed that he had like the full pair for, that he would be interested in, selling to me, because he thought that like, I should have it or something. And I that created this new story for me, in this way of like, this isn't just some random thing that I'm buying. This is like somebody who actually did claim it when I couldn't figure out how to claim it, and held it for 5 years, and, sort of picked me as somebody that he would let it go to, so it's like that actually made it much more special for me. So I kind of was talking to him and looking through the ones that he had. And I had always really liked the pirate, the pirate trait, eye patch, just because I feel like that fits with like internet ethos in so many ways, like internet piracy and, like all of those things. Like, my old roommate is like one of the people that, created the Pirate Bay, right? Like, so it's just like that world and, hackers and all of this stuff. Like I felt like the pirate trait was just really good. And, I like the simply clean one. So, the 1 pixel for the Frown was just too good to, like I just liked it once I saw it, and it just worked. And so I was able to, work out a deal with him. And it just, I love that story. I love how it got to me. I love what it is. So amazing. It was pretty perfect.
Nice. I've been I've been hearing a lot of stories around Tony Herrera as well. He's seems to be helping out a lot of punks in the space as well, right? And a good sort of soul. So I need to try and find if I can get a way to get him on.
Yeah, he's
So
fantastic. An absolute gem in this community. Like, just wants the best for all of it in every way.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And so and how did you find him? Just hanging out in the Discord or Punk's Discord or
No, actually, I had heard. I mean, I knew who he was, just because there's only so many original claimers, right? And so once you start digging around and doing that, you start seeing the same kind of names around. So I knew who he was, and then I had heard that he was in the kind of the V1 community. I'd heard that he was like actively trying to like help people get pairs, like he understood the sort of value in this. And it's kind of interesting because I talked to a number of the, original claimers, and there's this issue where like they claimed it on, like the 12th or the 13th, or, they claimed it before the Mashable article ran, right? I mean, that's like a big moment in like CryptoPunks history, is like the Mashable article was on the 17th. So if you claimed your CryptoPunks before the 17th, you were like really paying attention, and then they sold out on the 17th, and then the bug was found and all of this sort of stuff, right? And then so the V2s were all released on the 23rd. So all the V2s have a claim date of the 23rd. That's when they were minted, right? So there's this 2-week history and bragging rights that a lot of those original claimers have that is sort of lost because they're like, no, I claimed my thing on the 11th, like I don't care that it says the 23rd, it was the 11th. And so, it was kind of interesting talking to, to some of these people and seeing that. And so I'd heard that Tony was interested in finding people who, were to put those pairs back together for people, to pay attention to that. And then at NFT NYC, I went with some photographers to this DGen arcade that people were kind of putting together, and I don't know whether maybe I knew Tony was involved with. I don't know whether I knew Tony was involved with it, but I knew like some interesting people were involved with it. I knew there was some sort of CryptoPunk stuff kind of happening around it in a way. And I went there and I won a Meebit. They had this like vending machine, like it was like a UFO catcher game, and I was like, oh, I'll play this thing, and I did it, and I won a Meebit, and it was Tony's. Like he had donated the Meebit for it, and so I kind of started talking to him outside, and he was like, oh wait, you're Sean Bonner? He's like, I've read a bunch of your stuff, and I was like, whoa, like I know who this guy is, but he knows who I am, and that's like cool. And so then we just started chatting a little bit, and then messaging a little bit after that, and that's when I was like, yeah, I'm trying to find a good one. And he was like, I want to get you a good one, and so it worked out nicely.
That's a really cool story. Thanks for sharing that. One thing that you did talk about, which is interesting, that I don't know if people are really looking at that way. I think everybody knows about the dev punks, the first 1,000 punks, and so there's a bit of collectability and value around that. And I think
it's actually the first 1008.
1008. There you go.
Yeah.
And then the other part too is basically when was it actually minted? Might be an interesting one to look at, which punks were actually minted on the earlier date than rather the 17th, right, or after the 17th.
In the kind of the V1 community,
that Mashable article.
So that's an interesting thing that like you can't find that out by looking at CryptoPunks right now. Like you can't look, you don't know it from the V2s. Like the only way to find that out is to dig through the old contracts and these stuff. So, I think that's one of the pieces that makes CryptoPunks so vivid and so rich and so exciting, is that there are all of these different stories that kind of come together to build. It's not just like, oh, here's an NFT collection that released and some people got it, right? I don't think CryptoPunks would be what it is today if that's what happened, right? I mean, if Matt and John were just like, oh, here it is, and then people bought it and it just went on, like that wouldn't connect
Yeah.
culturally in that same way. You know, you have to have these different stories and these kind of like, I don't want to say conflicts, but like struggles, right? You have to have these kind of these things come up that like you know, these difficulties that are like overcome, you know, like there's a little bit of that like bonding and yeah, I mean, it's like these little struggles that create you know, these sort of rich histories that then become, you know, kind of legend in the future, you know? And I mean, we're only talking about what, not even, you know, not even 6 years ago now, right? But it's like those little things, some of them will be lost, some of them will be, you know, brought back to the forefront, some of them will be rediscovered in years from now. You know, I mean, that's one of the beautiful things I think about all this blockchain stuff, that you would never be able to track this stuff with a painting, right? So we've created this whole new exciting aspect to art and to collectibles that, you know, I think is only going to continue to grow, you know, as this sort of immutable record of these things continues to be added to over the years. So I think it's very exciting.
Absolutely. I'm just curious as well. So you started off in the V1 community first.
Mm-hmm. Well,
so,
I mean, I wouldn't say, I wasn't in the V2 Discord, right? But I got Meebits when they minted. I was kind of hanging around Larva in that world. And of course I was on crypto Twitter and I was helping other people buy Cryptopunks, who were, you know, I don't want to say they were less discerning, but I knew people who were just like, I just want to buy a Cryptopunk, you know, or something like that. Or they were like, I want to find one that looks like me, you know? So I would like go dig and find one for them or something. But yeah, the first sort of punk community was, you know, sort of the V1s when that kind of came together. I was like, oh, here's some other people who are kind of interested in this like weird nerdy thing that maybe nobody cares about, you know?
Yeah. So just out of curiosity, do they have their own Discord? I say this because I've been like, in some ways, probably dismissive of V1s and funks and derivatives, because I think they just love shit posting on, you know, CryptoPunk tweets all the time. And they always try and pop in with some smart aleck comments. And so I think it sort of deterred me from looking any further into the community. But I think now that, you know, you've shared the story,
well, I think there's
interesting.
I think there's an important distinction between, you know, V1s and funks. And unfortunately, like, I think in the public eye, maybe only in the V2 holders eye, I don't know. But like there's some people who like stick those things in the same bucket, and they're not the same bucket at all. I mean, there's you know, there's people who are interested in punks who hold, you know, various different things on there, right? But like, I think that like funks is a very, very different thing, you know, that's complicated and challenging and weird in its own way, and has its own, you know, its own community around it. And I think that that's a very different world than V1 punks, which are actually like made by Larva Labs, and, you know, like that's more like the weird brother, you know, as opposed to like the neighbor down the street in that way, right? And I think that also, like, if you think of the CryptoPunk community, right, there's this really large, rich community, but then like, you know, maybe a very few people who are like really loud in public, right? And so people who aren't in the community only see those people and think that that's what it is. So I think that the actual V1 community is very different than the way it's sort of perceived primarily in the V2 community. I think it's quite different. But yeah, there is a Discord, and you know, it's linked on the Twitter and stuff. It's worth, you know, it's interesting.
I'll definitely check it out.
But there's a lot of the original claimers actually are there, because, you know, that's kind of like, you know, again, it's a small group of people that care about some weird nerdy shit. So, you know, that's where they're hanging out.
I love that stuff. And so Sean, like, what are you sort of collecting today? Like, what's in the bag? What do you enjoy collecting, and what do you sort of collect?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm a photographer, so I'm, you know, very interested in other photographers in that way. And, you know, I have artist friends that I've worked with for years that I've, been trying to get into this space. So I'm interested in their thing. But I think the largest collection of stuff I have, that's like conscious, like I'm going to go collect art stuff is photographs. So I have a lot of photography. A good bit of it is up in my my Cryptovoxels gallery. I have a gallery in Cryptovoxels where I put a bunch of the stuff up in there. And then I also like have, a lot of weird punk deriv things again, because like I find that to be super interesting, and especially a lot of the ones where they're like messing with CC0 stuff with nouns and moonbirds and like, all these sort of interesting, cultural like combinations of stuff. It's almost like a cover song, in some weird ways, right? And so for a lot of those things, especially because a lot of them are newer, it's like easy to go mint like 10 or 15 of things. So I have a lot of those things, not necessarily because I'm like, oh, I need to have 15 of these things, but kind of like it's a roll of the dice. Am I going to get something fun or something cool with it? There's a group called Capsule 21 that there's an artist named Piv and some people who are there, and they're like thinking very much of CryptoPunks in the context of contemporary art and doing a lot of contrasting, how do we reimagine these artworks in a museum sort of context or in relation to other popular artists. Like, how does this relate to Warhol? How does this relate to the old masters, like playing with like cubism and minimalism in this, so I find like what they're doing to be quite interesting in that way. So I think I'm also just tying back to what we've been talking about. I'm interested in the things where there's like communities around it, like if there's a bunch of people that are sort of really passionate about something, like I kind of want to go see what that's all about, like what makes them excited about this. And so I kind of try to jump into a lot of these things. I'm in way too many discords, but I think the things that get me most excited in that world right now are the sort of really positive, we're trying to build something communities. The stuff I'm less interested in are the negative, like we hate those people communities, because there's plenty of that kind of stuff around, right? And so like I'm trying to, there's only so many hours in the day, right? So I'm trying to spend them on positive communities that I feel like are, trying to make tomorrow better somehow, right?
And I think CryptoPunks definitely has to be on the top of the list. Most of the people I've interviewed are definitely more building and doers, for sure. So, and then when you look back at your NFT career to date, do you have any sort of best wins or losses or memorable moments that come to mind?
Yeah, I mean, well, not claiming CryptoPunks when I had the chances, certainly a loss on that one. I minted Bored Apes, so that was a win.
Wow.
I was able to get a lot of things by selling those, over the time. I sold 4 of them that I minted 2 weeks later because I was panicking that I couldn't believe that I just, spent that much on NFTs. So, that was a win and a loss, maybe.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think all of these things can kind of, depend on what perspective you're looking at it at the minute, right? Because selling 4 Bored Apes that I had just minted for 0.08, I think I sold them for like 0.35 each, that was a huge win. I was like, oh my God, I can't believe like how great this is, right. But then, now in hindsight, you're like, oh, so I think like wins and losses is, I don't know. I think it's all learning, right? And it's all an experience and it's all fun. And, I think where I am right now and what I'm doing right now is a accumulation of all of those things. So I wouldn't necessarily want to change them. Because even, could say right now, oh man, I wish I would have claimed, 100 of those CryptoPunks, but like, what would that have changed? Right. Like, I kind of like where I am right now and what's going on right now. And so, you know, messing with history too much would have, you know, maybe altered that.
And do you have like a favorite punk personality in the space that you like tuning into?
I don't know. I think that there's so many personalities, you know. I mean, well, there's what 6,000 holders or something. You know, right? It's like there's 3,000 holders. I don't how many
3,000. Yeah,
3,000.
3,000-ish.
3,000. Yes. I mean, that's a lot of people, right? I mean, there's like hard to say like, you know, who's the voice of that or anything, right? So it's like I think that yeah, I don't know that there's a single personality. I like
Okay.
I like the personalities that are, you know, around, and like you said, I think there's a lot of incredibly supportive and imaginative people doing stuff with this, and so it's like there's just an endless supply of interesting people. I think you know, every new
Absolutely.
conversation I have is with somebody who's doing something fantastically cool. So,
And if you could describe punk culture in a few words, how would you describe that?
um, so I think that's something that kind of changes a lot right now. You know, I mean, especially with the acquisition going from, you know, from the wild west of Larva Labs to clarified IP rights with Yuga, right? I mean, like what is punk culture in that way? And I also think that like where you're talking about is very different. I feel like the culture of the punk community in the punk Discord is quite different than the culture of the punk community in the Telegram group, which is quite different than the punk culture on Twitter, you know? So it's almost like these platforms and, you know, selective groups of people in different things, you know, influence that much more than the thing itself. I think that overall, you know, there's an aspect of, you know, interest in history and interest in earliness. I mean, of course, I can contradict myself because there's certainly people in the punk community that are just interested in flipping and, you know, making some ETH on it tomorrow or something, so they're not as interested in the history on it or whatever, right? But the people that I'm drawn to, I guess, in it are, you know, the people who recognize that there's a larger thing happening here, and this is sort of a it is sort of an independent, even though it's corporately owned in this way, right? I mean, it is this sort of symbol of like some people who are just like, let's just go make something and put it out and see what happens. You know, there's sort of like, you know, it's not the first, but it's still like sort of like one of the first. It's like this like a pioneering spirit of like, let's just jump into this unknown and see what happens with it and try to build something cool with it. And I think that theme and that idea, you know, kind of runs the thread through punk culture of and you know, that ties with punk rock in that way too, right? Of like, we're not really sure what's going to happen here, but we're going to go do it because it's something that we want to do, and we're gonna see what happens, and we're going to build something of our own. And I think that that's, you know, a consistent piece.
Beautiful. And if you could pass on a message to the next owner of your punk, what would you like to say to them?
Gosh, that's such a hard question. I knew that you're going to ask that, and I've been thinking about it, and you know, because in a way it sort of like forces you to think about your own mortality. You know, if you're kind of a holder in that kind of way, or you know, like, oh, am I going to like pass this on to my kid, or what am I going to do? And I think that you know, because I'm not buying these, you know, to flip them next week and see what happens. You know, like I have the bigger thing of it. So I think that what I would say is, you know, like I told you, like the story of it getting to me, you know, with Tony claiming it and holding it for all that, like that means a lot to me. And so I really like that story that it had. So I would just hope that whoever gets this next, that I'm able to sort of add to that story in something that, you know, is meaningful to them.
You already have, Sean. It's on the blockchain, and this podcast is there to prove it. So
Yeah.
I'm sure you're doing amazing things.
Well, thank you.
Awesome. And then so Sean, I think that this has been a really fun chat. I guess any closing comments on your side, and I guess just how can sort of people reach out to you if they need to, or if you want to share any of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the easiest way to find me is on Twitter. I'm at Sean Bonner on Twitter. But the internet is, I'm SeanBonner.com. I'm Sean Bonner on Instagram. I'm Sean Bonner everywhere. So looking for me is pretty easy to track down. I think, I don't really have a huge insightful closing comment so much as, that I appreciate that you're doing this because, like we were talking about before, I think that there's a lot of really interesting stories that, people don't know, and they're kind of hidden under the noise of everything that's happening. And having something like this where you can take a little bit of time and sort of dig in and bubble some of that stuff up, I think it's going to lead to a really great collection of stories and people, and help tell this story to the next generations, right? So
Absolutely.
Yeah, I love it.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Sean. And really enjoyed having you on the chat. And I'll definitely tune into your blog a little bit more too. I think you write really well. So I'm only able to dig in a couple of the blogs, but I need to definitely dive in. But I'll put all that information in the show notes.
Yeah, totally. So there's a couple different blog posts recently that are, punk specific, right? I mean, I've sort of been talking about digital identity, but also punk. I've talked a lot about punks, maybe too much about punks, but there's a lot of punks blog posts.
The more the better. So I mean, I'm really grateful as well, because I think every single time I'm having these conversations, I'm learning more about punks, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think you just educating me a little bit more about the V1 today was really helpful too. So thank you.
Yeah, fantastic.
Awesome. So thanks everyone for listening. This wraps up another episode of PunkCast for the week, and we'll be back next week with another punk. Bye for now.